There are some logic games that have what I like to think of as an incomplete rule. And to me, what that refers to is in a game where you have subcategories like this, where you have 3 bears, 3 giraffes, or in a game where you have letters that can go more than one time, an incomplete rule is a rule that explicitly tells you about one of those subcategory members, or maybe multiple of those subcategory members, but then there's some element of that rule that also tells you about the rest of them. So if that's a little bit confusing, I want to take a look at a couple of examples of what I mean, and you can see this kind of rule in action and what's important about how we understand these kinds of rules. So first of all, in this game, we have 3 bears and 3 giraffes. They're each scheduled to perform at a zoo show on Friday, and we're keeping track of the order in which they perform. Since they're all going one at a time, I'll go ahead and draw 6 slots like this. I'll have another row to keep track of whether it's a bear or a giraffe, and my 6 variables are going to go at the bottom here. So now let's take a look at the first rule. H performs before exactly 2 of the giraffes. So H is a bear and performs before exactly 2 giraffes. So this is how a lot of students would first understand this rule or draw it on their diagram. They would do something like this. There's an H dash and then exactly 2G. Now this is a correct understanding of this rule, but this is what I think of as an incomplete rule because it tells you H is before exactly 2 of the giraffes, and we've represented those exactly 2 giraffes. But the rule is also telling us about the other giraffe, the 3rd giraffe. Where does the other giraffe go if H is before exactly 2 of the giraffes? Well, the 3rd giraffe has to come before the H. So in other words, we need exactly 1 giraffe before H and 2 giraffes after H. And instead of just writing 1 giraffe or 2 giraffes, what I would actually do is something like this. This is visually showing us that there is a giraffe before the H, and we have to have at least 2 other giraffes after the H. So that's how I diagram rule number 1, and I think of it as an incomplete rule because the rule itself only explicitly told us about exactly 2 of the giraffes, but it's also telling us about the other giraffe. There's an unstated part of this rule that's important to capture if we really want to understand this rule the best way we can. Now let's take a look at the second rule. M is not the first giraffe to perform. So a lot of students might write something like this. M is not the first giraffe. But here I want to apply the principle of turning the negative into the positive. This rule is phrased in terms of what's not allowed or what's not going to happen. But I want to think about what does this mean then? What positively does this mean? Well, if M is not the first giraffe, then that means there has to be at least 1 giraffe before M. So this is a better way of representing this rule. And now that we've represented rule 1 and rule 2 in a more visually complete manner, we might be able to see how these rules interact. And so let me go ahead and just recopy rule 1 over here. Let's see how rule 2 might fit in. If M, which is a giraffe, has to have at least 1 other giraffe before it, well that means M cannot be the first giraffe here. And if M is not the first giraffe here, then who could be this first giraffe? Well, it's got to be either K or L. And so I'm going to write that in over here. We know that the exactly 1 G before H has to be K or L. And that means the other G's here are going to be M or the other one of L or K. And that's what I'll write over here. So now we've actually combined rule 1 and rule 2. We don't have to worry about them in our list of rules anymore. We just have to focus on this. And this kind of connection would have been a lot more difficult to make if we didn't understand rule 1 in its complete form. If we didn't think about all of the G's, even though the rule only told us about 2 of the G's. Here's another example of a game involving an incomplete rule. This one says that Aqua Shack employs 4 lifeguards, Q, R, S, and T. Exactly 2 of these lifeguards work each day from Monday to Thursday. So that seems like we're going to have a base that's going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we're going to have 2 slots, 2 lifeguards on each day. We also know that each lifeguard works on exactly 2 days. So here's how I'll draw my setup. Each day we'll have 2 of the lifeguards, and we have to see each of these letters going twice. Now, one thing that you want to note is because it says that exactly 2 of the lifeguards work on each day, that means you can't have Q, the lifeguard, for example, going like this. You can't have the same letter going twice on the same day, because then there's only one lifeguard working on that day. This is not allowed. You have to split apart each of these letters. So the 2 Q's have to go on different days, same with the 2 R's, the 2 S's, and the 2 T's. Now let's take a look at the first rule. The first day on which Q works is earlier than the first day on which S works. So here's how a lot of students would diagram the rule. They'll do something like this. The first Q, Q1, has to go before the first S, S1. And that is what the rule means. But this is an example of what I think of as an incomplete rule because we have multiple Q's and we have multiple S's in the game. So when this rule is only telling us about the first Q, the first day on which Q works, and the first S, I want to think about what that means about the second Q and the second S. Where would the second Q and the second S go in relation to this diagram? Well, the second Q would have to come after the first Q, and the second S has to come after the first S, so it's got to look something like this. And the benefit of diagramming the rule this way is now you can actually see that the first Q is quite limited. The first Q cannot go on Wednesday or Thursday because you need to have enough room for the S's on 2 different days after that. That's not as immediately obvious if we didn't diagram these other parts. Now let's take a look at the second rule, which says the second day on which T works is the same as the first day on which R works. So again, a lot of students would diagram the rule like this. T2, the second T, has to go on the same day as the first R. But to me, this is an incomplete rule because this is also telling us something about the other T. What day or where would the first T go in relation to this block? Where would the second R go in relation to this block? Well, the first T is going to come before the block and the second R is going to come after the block. So this is actually how I want to visualize this rule. And if you diagram the rule like this, it's a lot easier to see that this T2R1 block is actually quite limited. It can only fit on Tuesday or Wednesday. So now that we've diagrammed these rules in a more visually complete way, I want to show you how this way of diagramming or this way of thinking about the rules can help us in making worlds for this setup. You see, if I got these 2 rules here in this game, I'd be thinking about where this block can go. Remember, this block can only go in Tuesday or Wednesday, and since that's only 2 different spaces and it looks like you're going to know other things about the other letters in each of those worlds, I'm going to go ahead and draw both of those worlds out. So the first world will have the T2R1 on Tuesday, the second one will have it on Wednesday. And now if we're applying the second rule here to the first world, we know that T1 will go on Monday, and we know that R2 will have to go somewhere on Wednesday or Thursday. So this is how I'll diagram that. And in the second world, you know that the second R will have to go on Thursday, and the first T will have to go on Monday or Tuesday. So that's how I'll diagram that. Now we're done with rule 2. Let's turn to rule number 1. Q1 has to come before S1, S2, and Q2. Do you notice that we need to have 3 horizontal spaces here to accommodate Q1, S1, S2. So that means that Q1 will have to go on Monday like this, and the S's will have to go like this. You gotta have the 2 S's on Wednesday and Thursday. And now what does that mean about the second Q, Q2? Well, it's gonna come after the first Q, and that's just gonna be somewhere on Wednesday or Thursday. So Q2 and R2 are actually gonna be switching off on Wednesday and Thursday. So that's how I diagram this first world. Everything ends up being almost completely determined. Now we'll apply the first rule to the second world. We still have to accommodate Q1 before S1 and S2, so that means Q1 will have to go on Monday because you need to have room for S1 and S2 to go after it. Now what does that mean about the remaining letter, which is Q2? Well, that has to come after the first Q, and since the first Q is on Monday, that means Q2 will have to go on Tuesday like this, and that forces T1 into a Monday. So there we have the second world complete. So what I want you to take away from this video is when you are dealing with a game where the letters can repeat, you have repeated variables like this, if you get a rule that only tells you about one of those variables, remember the first rule only told us about Q1 being before S1, when you get a rule like that, you always want to make sure to think about what does that mean about the other version of those letters? What does that mean about the other Q? What does that mean about the other S? And in rule number 2, the initial rule only started with this. But since you have multiple T's and multiple R's, does that rule tell you anything about where the other T and the other R go? And in addition, if you are dealing with a game where there are subcategories for your variables, if you have a rule that's telling you about only some members of a subcategory, remember the first rule just told us about H being before exactly 2 giraffes, you have to make sure to think about, well, what does that mean about the other member of that subcategory, about the other giraffe? And that's how it's the best way to visualize what the rule is actually saying.